The key thing to remember with mooting is to start with the proper salutation at the beginning. So you want to start with, "May it please the court." Just a very simple point, but it's a good way of, if you're in a competition, not losing any points, and then going into the submissions from there. So what I've noticed from the mooters tonight, and it was mooters across the board, was a very good pace. So it's always important when you're delivering your submissions to make sure that you're speaking nice and clearly and nice and slowly, because it just makes it a lot easier for the judges to follow the points that you're making, and particularly if the judges are trying to make notes as they're going along. So a good, nice, slow pace is always important. What you really want to focus on is using the skeleton argument to your advantage. So of course, with speed mooting, we provide the skeleton argument for you, and you can use as much or as little of the skeleton argument as you like. So I think there were 4 points on the skeleton argument there. You can use all 4, you can just use 1, that's fine. But what you really want to do, and what was done quite well tonight, is at the outset, setting out a roadmap for the judge as to where you're going, explaining to the judge which points you're going to be relying upon and in what order. Second point that comes on from that is to remember to use the case law to your advantage. So you might have, a point that in law makes a lot of sense. It's a very sensible argument. But if you're not making reference to any case law whatsoever, you're not going to do particularly well in the moot, because remember that you're trying to convince the judges that you're correct in law. So you need to always bring it back and make reference to the case law. If there's any particular quotes from a case that you think is important, you can use that to your advantage as well. So, you might be making reference to the case of DPP and VVA, and you might say there was a particular quote from a judge that assists your argument. Feel free to read that out to the judge. And when you make reference to that particular part of the judgment, make sure that the judge is on side with you in terms of where they are in the judgment. So you might say, I'm going to quote from Lord Widgery on page 56, paragraph 4, line 3, and make sure the judge finds that before you move on. You don't want to start reading the judgment or reading the quote and the judge is still flicking away trying to find the point. So really make sure that the judge has time to find it. Watch them, look at their pen, look at their eyes. When you know the judge has found the right part, carry on from there and read it out, and make, once you've read that quote, explain why it is that you're relying upon that and how that assists your argument. But the key point being, if you're doing a moot, make sure you're making reference to case law and using it to your advantage. Likewise, you might find that you're in a particular moot whereby the law isn't in your favor and there are particular cases that go against you. So what you need to do there is you need to be really quite careful and think about how you can use the case law to your advantage. So think about ways that you can distinguish the case law. Look at the particular factual matrix of your case and the existing case law, and look at any ways that you can differ them and show how your case is particularly different, or even look through the cases to find any dissenting judgments and maybe quote obiter from the judgment. Judicial intervention is quite important in these cases. One thing that I did tonight is I was asking questions of all of the mooters by way of judicial intervention. When you're answering the question, it's really important to remember to try and stay respectful to the judge. So a judge might make a point and you may well be disagreeing, but you want to start by saying, I'm going to respectfully disagree because X, Y, and Z. And you can really prepare for the judicial intervention in advance. So when you're preparing for the case, think about where the weaknesses are in your argument or the strengths in your opponent's argument, because that's going to be an obvious point for judicial intervention. So you can bet your bottom dollar that those weaknesses are where the questions are going to come from. So have a good think about them and prepare for that in advance. And that way, when the question comes, you won't be surprised. You're not going to look like a rabbit in the headlights, and you'll be able to give a sensible answer off the cuff. And if for any reason the judge does ask something that you're not expecting for whatever reason, don't be afraid to have a second to think, have a quick pause, have a think about it and answer when you're ready, because there's often a temptation to try and jump in too quickly, give an answer that really doesn't assist. And then as you're giving the answer, you think, oh, it would have been better to say. The other thing to remember as well is that when you're answering the question, keep the answer as simple as possible. There's quite often a tendency to want to waffle a bit too much, and you can answer the question and then carry on talking and carry on talking and carry on talking. The reality is you need to be stealthy. Once you've given the answer, that's it. Say, I hope that assists your lordship, and move on. Because the more you talk, the more you're opening yourself up to potentially saying something that doesn't help your case. So once you've given that answer, stop. Just a couple of final points. Think about the terminology that you use throughout your mooting as well. So you wouldn't say, I think. You're in a professional capacity here, so you need to make these submissions professional. So, I've heard reference tonight to it being my application is, or I think that. You need to keep it simple. It is my submission, or I submit that. Try and avoid, if possible, reading from a script, particularly for mooting, because it can be pretty obvious to a judge whether you're in person and you're obviously there sort of watching a script like that, or if you're on Zoom, the judge can see your eyes moving across a screen like that. So you really need to practice in advance so that you're not limited to a script. And it's good for a number of reasons, because if you're not tied to a script and you're not reading from a script, then you're not going to be sort of appearing quite wooden in your submissions, and you can be a lot more convincing when it comes out more naturally because you've practiced in advance. And the other reason as well is judges can quite often pick up when you're reading from a script. So what they'll do is they'll say, you might be on point 1, and they'll say, okay, well, thank you for those submissions, but I'm concerned with point 3 of the skeleton arguments. And at that point, you need to jump to point 3. The judge isn't concerned about what comes in between. You need to jump there. So the more you practice, the more familiar you become with your submissions, the better you can deal with any situations like that, and the more adaptable you become. And once again, that just makes your submissions a lot more convincing if you can jump about between your arguments. And then lastly, if ever you do find you trip up, you get lost with where you're up to, don't panic. I've seen it, and what people can do quite often is they panic and they'll go, oh, I don't know where I'm up to. Sorry about this. Forgive me, Lord. Let me just find this. Stay calm. The judge knows that you've lost where you're up to, so just stay calm, take a breather, have a glance down back at your notes, and then carry on from there. It appears more professional and can really stand you in good stead later in the moot. So if ever it happens, and it will happen at some point where you lose your point, you lose your thread, just stay calm, take a breath, pause for a second or two, find where you're up to, and carry on.